The stagecoach came in 2 hours late, and trailing a cloud of red dust so thick it looked like the whole Arizona territory was trying to swallow it whole. And Cyrus Hale stood at the edge of the Redemption Springs depot with his father's letter folded in his breast pocket and a secret burning a hole clean through his chest. He had not meant to be there. That was the honest truth of it, and Cyrus had always been a man who could look himself in the eye come morning. He had ridden into town for feed and hardware, and a new length of rope for the South Corral, the kind of ordinary errand that filled the days of a ranching man without poetry or ceremony. But when old Pete Dawson at the general store had mentioned, with that particular crow-like delight he reserved for other people's business, that the eastbound stage was carrying a passenger expected at the Hale Ranch, Cyrus had felt something cold and specific settle in his stomach. His father, Elias Hale, had sent for a bride. Cyrus had known it was coming. He had found the advertisement in his father's desk drawer 3 weeks prior, while searching for the land survey papers. A carefully worded notice placed in a Chicago newspaper seeking a woman of good character and practical sensibility to join a prosperous ranch in the Arizona territory. His father was 52 years old, still hale in the way the name suggested, but lonesome in a way that had grown sharper and more visible since Cyrus's mother, Margaret, had died of fever 2 winters past. The advertisement made a kind of sense. The marriage arrangement it proposed made a kind of sense. What made no sense at all, to Cyrus's mind, was that his father had said nothing to him about it directly. Nothing at face value, nothing over supper, nothing in the long, comfortable silences that father and son had developed in place of the harder conversations. The letter in Cyrus's pocket was the extent of his father's communication on the matter. He had found it on the kitchen table that very morning, propped against the salt cellar like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. The letter said that Elias had ridden north to the Carrigan spread to look at a bull he was considering purchasing, and that a Miss Ada Wells would be arriving on the afternoon stage from Tucson, and would Cyrus be so good as to collect her and see her settled at the ranch house, as Elias himself would not return until the following morning at the earliest. Cyrus had read the letter 3 times. He had then saddled his bay gelding, Buck, ridden to town, completed his errands with remarkable efficiency, and found himself standing at the depot doing something he had not quite decided to do until he was already doing it. The stage swayed and creaked and groaned to a stop. The driver, a weathered man named Hank Stubbs who had been hauling people across the territory since before Cyrus was born, climbed down from the box with the slow deliberateness of a man whose joints held strong opinions about the matter. He opened the door and helped down a traveling drummer in a brown suit, then a heavy-set rancher Cyrus recognized from the Holloway spread, and then a woman in blue. She was not what Cyrus had expected, though he could not have said precisely what he had expected. The woman his father had described in the advertisement, sensible, practical, of good character, those words had conjured in Cyrus's imagination a solid and capable figure, a woman like the land itself, reliable and enduring. Ada Wells was that, he would learn, but she was also something the advertisement had not managed to account for. She was somewhere in her mid-20s, with dark hair pinned under a practical traveling hat that had nevertheless seen better days, and eyes the particular shade of warm brown that made a man think of October light falling through autumn leaves. She wore a dress the color of a clear sky after rain, and she held a valise in one hand and a small reticule in the other, and she stood at the depot door looking out at Redemption Springs, Arizona territory, in the year of our Lord 1884, with an expression that was trying very hard to appear composed and not quite succeeding. She looked, Cyrus thought, like a woman who had come a very long way and was not entirely certain the journey had been worth it, but who was absolutely determined to proceed regardless. He crossed the dirt street toward her before he had made any conscious decision to do so. "Miss Wells." he said, removing his hat because his mother had raised him properly, even in the middle of complicated situations. She turned and looked at him, and something in her expression shifted, not relief exactly, but a kind of careful assessment followed by a tentative settling. "Yes," she said, "I am Ada Wells." "I'm here from the Hale Ranch," Cyrus said, and every word of that was true. "Oh," she said, and her composure settled more firmly into place. "Mr. Hale." "I did not expect, that is, I had imagined." She paused and began again, with the quality of a woman who had been taught that a sentence, once begun, ought to be finished properly. "I did not expect someone to meet me personally. I was prepared to inquire about a conveyance." "No need," Cyrus said. He had brought the buckboard, thank God, because it was a practical thing to bring to town when collecting supplies, and it meant there was room for her trunk. "I have the wagon. Can I take that for you?" He reached for her valise and she let him take it, which was the first concession he saw her make. She kept the reticule. Hank Stubbs wrestled a modest trunk down from the boot of the stage, and Cyrus loaded it into the buckboard with the sacks of feed and the coil of rope, which he felt obscurely ashamed of, as though a woman arriving to begin a new chapter of her life deserved better than to ride alongside livestock supplies. He helped her up onto the seat, which she accepted with a quiet dignity, and then he climbed up on the other side and took the reins. "It is about 8 miles to the ranch," he said. "The road is reasonable for the first 4, less reasonable after that." She looked at him then with the particular look of a person adjusting their expectations. "I see," she said. "How long have you worked for Mr. Hale?" And there it was, the question he should have been prepared for and was not. Cyrus kept his eyes on Buck's ears and the road ahead and thought with remarkable clarity that this was the precise moment at which a man of good character ought to clarify the situation. He ought to say, "I do not work for Mr. Hale. I am his son. You are here to marry my father. There are things we should discuss before we arrive at the ranch." He thought all of that very clearly. What he said was, "A long time, my whole life more or less," which was, if he was being very charitable to himself, not technically a lie. Ada Wells nodded as though this were perfectly satisfactory, and they rode out of Redemption Springs together in the long slanted light of a late afternoon that was turning the desert gold and pink, and the distant mountains, a shade of purple that never looked quite real no matter how many times Cyrus had seen it. She did not chatter, which he respected. She looked at the country around her with the focused attention of someone memorizing terrain, and occasionally she asked practical questions about water sources and the nearest town, and what the winters were like, and whether the ranch ran cattle or horses or both. He answered honestly. He told her about the cattle operation, the 200 head of mixed stock his father had been building up for 15 years. He told her about the winters, which were mild compared to what she was likely accustomed to in Ohio, where the letter had been posted from. He told her about Redemption Springs and its single main street and its 3 saloons and its one church that served 3 different congregations on a rotating schedule, because none of them had enough members to fill the building on their own. She laughed at that, a genuine laugh, brief and unguarded, that she seemed mildly surprised to hear coming from herself. "That is either very practical or very ecumenical," she said. "Reverend Moss calls it both," Cyrus said. "Mostly it means the Methodists and the Baptists have to be civil to each other once every 3 weeks." She smiled. It was the kind of smile that started at the corners of the eyes before it reached the mouth. Cyrus found himself cataloging details he had no business cataloging about a woman his father had sent for. "You know the town well," she said. "Grew up near it," he said, which was the truth and also a door he opened no further. The road turned rough after the 4-mile mark, as promised, and Ada Wells gripped the side of the buckboard with one hand without making any comment about it, which told Cyrus something about the quality of her self-possession. The sun was sitting low and heavy on the western edge of the world by the time the Hale Ranch came into view. The main house, a solid adobe and timber structure that Cyrus's father had built with his own hands over 3 summers, and the bunkhouse beyond it, and the barn that had needed a new roof 2 springs ago and gotten one, and the horse corral and the kitchen garden that had run a little wild since Margaret Hale had died. Ada Wells looked at it all with those careful, assessing eyes. Cyrus watched her and tried to read her expression and found he could not quite do it. "It is larger than I expected," she said at last. "My father works hard," Cyrus said, and there was something in his voice when he said it that might have told her more than the words themselves. He helped her down from the buckboard and carried her trunk inside, which was when she encountered Maria Quintero, who had been cooking and keeping house at the Hale Ranch 3 days a week for the past 4 years, and who was currently standing in the kitchen doorway with an expression that made it extremely clear she had opinions about the evening's proceedings. Maria was 60 years old and had buried a husband and raised 5 children in this territory, and had no patience for nonsense of any variety. She looked at Ada Wells, and then she looked at Cyrus Hale with a look that said she could see exactly what was happening here, and she was reserving judgment until she knew more. "Miss Wells," Cyrus said in the tone of a man walking carefully, "this is Maria Quintero who keeps the house. She has prepared a room for you." Maria's expression did not shift, but she dipped her head toward Ada with a graciousness that she maintained because she was a gracious woman regardless of what she privately thought. "Welcome," she said. "Supper is ready when you are." Ada was tired. It showed in the set of her shoulders and the shadows under her eyes, and Cyrus felt something twist in his chest at the sight of it. This woman had come a very long way, on a stagecoach, alone, to a place she had never seen, to marry a man she had never met. Whatever he thought about the arrangement, whatever complicated feelings had been building in him since he had picked up that letter from beside the salt cellar, he could at least recognize the courage that required. He carried her trunk to the room Maria had prepared, the good guest room, with the window that faced east and caught the morning light, and when he turned to say good night, Ada Wells was standing in the doorway looking at him with an expression that he found difficult to name. Not suspicious, not quite, but attentive in a way that made him feel the weight of everything he had not said. "Thank you," she said. "Mr." She paused. "I realize I never asked your name." The moment stretched out between them like a rope pulled tight. "Cyrus," he said. "Cyrus Hale." The silence that followed had a texture to it. Ada Wells blinked once. Her chin lifted almost imperceptibly. She was processing something, he could see it, the quick and careful movement of a thoughtful mind working through a new arrangement of facts. Then she said very precisely, "Hale." "Yes, ma'am," Cyrus said. Another beat of silence. Then, "I see." She did not ask the question that was sitting plainly in the air between them, and he did not offer the answer that should have come hours ago. They looked at each other in the doorway of the guest room in the fading evening light, 2 people in possession of a mutual understanding that neither of them had yet chosen to address out loud. "Good night, Mr. Cyrus Hale," she said, with a particular emphasis that told him she understood now exactly who he was and had chosen, for reasons of her own, not to make a scene about it tonight. "Good night, Miss Wells," he said, and meant it in more ways than one. He did not sleep particularly well. He lay in his own bed in his own room on the other side of the house, and stared at the ceiling and thought about the way she had said his name, and the way she had looked at the land when they drove in, and the way she had laughed at the story about the church, and he thought about his father coming home tomorrow, and the conversation that was going to need to happen, and none of these thoughts were comfortable. But the one that sat most persistently on his chest, the one he could not shake no matter which way he turned it, was the simplest and the most impossible. Ada Wells was not, in any practical or legal sense, meant for him. She was meant for his father. She had come across half the country on the strength of letters and an advertisement, and whatever hope a woman in her circumstances had to offer to an arrangement like this, and he had met her at the stage and not told her the truth for 8 miles and an entire evening, and now here they were. He fell asleep somewhere near midnight and dreamed about nothing useful. Morning came in hard and bright the way it did in Arizona, burning the night off the desert in 10 minutes flat, and Cyrus was up before Maria, and had the coffee on before Ada Wells appeared in the kitchen doorway in a fresh dress the color of dry grass, her dark hair braided and pinned, looking like someone who had slept more soundly than they deserved after yesterday's revelations. She looked at him standing at the stove, and neither of them said good morning right away. They just looked at each other in the early light with the particular wariness of two people who have been not quite honest with each other and are now deciding what to do about it. "Coffee," Cyrus said, because he had to say something. "Please," she said, and she sat down at the table with a straightness of spine that he recognized now as her default expression of inner composure. He poured the coffee and set it in front of her and poured his own, and then, because there was no good way to go around it and he had spent the night feeling the weight of going around it, he sat down across from her and said, "I owe you an explanation." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "You do," she agreed mildly. "When you asked if I worked for Mr. Hale, I should have told you the truth. Elias Hale is my father. He was supposed to meet you himself, but he had business up north and left me a note asking me to collect you, and he stopped. I did not correct you when you assumed I was a ranch hand, and that was wrong of me." Ada Wells looked at her coffee for a long moment. Then she looked up at him, and there was something in those warm brown eyes that was not anger precisely, but was adjacent to it and also adjacent to several other things. "So I was brought here to marry your father," she said. "Yes." "And your father is not here. He'll be back by midday, I expect." She nodded slowly. "The letters," she said, "the correspondence, it was Mr. Elias Hale who wrote them." "I believe so." She was quiet for a moment in a way that had the quality of a woman reviewing a sequence of events she had believed she understood and finding that the understanding needs adjustment. Then she said, quietly, "He wrote well. His letters they were kind and honest, and they described this land with real love. I thought—" She stopped herself. Then she continued with the deliberate composure of someone choosing each word carefully. "I thought I knew something about the man I was coming to meet." "You may still find that to be true," Cyrus said, and meant it honestly because his father was a good man. She looked at him directly. "Do you have an opinion about this arrangement?" It was the kind of question that required more courage to ask than it appeared to, and Cyrus recognized that. He held her gaze. "I think my father is a good man," he said. "I think he is lonely since my mother died. I think this arrangement is more common out here than people in the East might realize, and that it works out more often than it doesn't." He paused. "And I think that none of that is really an answer to what you were asking." Something shifted in her expression, a small surprised opening, like a window being unlatched in a house that had been shut up against the cold. "No," she said, "it isn't. I don't have an opinion that would be appropriate to share," he said carefully. "My father's business is his own." She studied him for a moment. Then she nodded once, and the window closed again, and she picked up her coffee and drank it, and Cyrus did the same, and they sat across the table from each other in the morning light with the unspoken thing sitting between them, large and warm and impossible. Maria arrived at 7:30 and produced a breakfast of exceptional quality without any visible acknowledgement of the tension in the kitchen, which was either professional courtesy or the strategy of a woman who was waiting for more information before she committed to an opinion. After breakfast, Cyrus went out to his work and Ada Wells went out to walk the property, which she did in a systematic and purposeful way that suggested she was cataloging what she had come to. Cyrus watched her from the fence line where he was working on a broken post and felt the particular helplessness of a man who can see exactly how a situation is arranged and cannot see any honest way to rearrange it. Elias Hale rode in just before noon. He was a big man, Elias, broad through the shoulders in the way that life of physical work builds into a man over decades, with gray at his temples and a sun-weathered face that had been handsome in youth, and had settled into something better, substantial and reliable, and marked by time in the way good things are marked by time. He swung down from his horse in the yard with the ease of a man who had been riding these hills since before his son was born, and he looked across the yard to where Ada Wells was coming around the corner of the house from the kitchen garden, and he stopped. Cyrus came in from the fence line in time to see both of them standing in the yard looking at each other across 20 feet of Arizona dust. "Miss Wells," Elias said, removing his hat. His voice had gone careful and formal in a way Cyrus recognized as his father's version of nervous, which was not something he saw often. "Mr. Hale," Ada said, and her voice was perfectly level, and Cyrus saw his father's eyes flick to him with a question in them. "Cyrus," Elias said. "She arrived yesterday as planned," Cyrus said. "I collected her from the stage. Maria has been keeping things in order." Elias looked between them with the focused intelligence of a man who had been reading other people across a supper table for decades. He put his hat back on and walked across the yard to Ada Wells and offered his hand, and she shook it with a firm and businesslike grip that Cyrus suspected was calculated to establish the terms of the interaction immediately. "I'm glad you made it safely," Elias said. "It's a long journey." "It is," she agreed. "It is also a very beautiful country. I walked the property this morning. Your kitchen garden needs attention." Elias blinked. "It does," he said after a moment. "My wife used to manage it. I've been less attentive than I should be." "I noticed," Ada said, not unkindly. "There is good soil there. With some work it could be substantial again." Elias looked at her with an expression that was trying to recalibrate, and Cyrus had to look away because watching his father be nervous was not something he knew how to witness comfortably. The afternoon that followed was one of the more peculiar of Cyrus Hale's experience. Ada Wells and Elias Hale sat in the front room and had what was clearly a careful and considered conversation. Cyrus was not present for it and did not try to be, and when it concluded, and Ada went to help Maria with supper preparation and Elias came out to the barn where Cyrus was working, there was something different in his father's face. Not disappointment. More like a man who had been expecting one thing and found another and was still sorting out what he thought about it. "She is not what I expected," Elias said. "What did you expect?" Cyrus said, focusing on the leather he was mending. "Something quieter, maybe," Elias said after a moment. "She told me straight off the kitchen garden needs attention." "It does." Elias sat down on the milking stool that had been in the barn since Cyrus was 8 years old. "She's younger than I thought," he said. "The letters she writes like an older woman, steady, considered. I had imagined she is 26, Cyrus said, which he had not actually been told but had reasoned out from things she had mentioned the previous evening. Elias looked at him. "How do you know that?" Cyrus shrugged and kept his eyes on the leather. His father was quiet for a long time. The barn sounds filled the space between them, the shifting of horses, the occasional call of a bird in the rafters, the distant sound of wind against the walls. Then Elias said, in a voice that was careful and watching, "How was the drive from town?" "Fine," Cyrus said. "Did you talk, some, about the ranch, the country, the church in town that serves 3 congregations?" Elias almost smiled. "She asked about that. I told her about it. She thought it was either practical or ecumenical." Elias was quiet again. Then in a different tone, "She's a fine woman." "Yes," Cyrus said, "she is." Another silence. His father stood up from the milking stool and dusted his hands on his trousers and said, in the voice of a man closing a subject, "I'm grateful you collected her. I should have arranged it better." Cyrus said nothing. Elias went back to the house. Cyrus sat with the leather in his hands for a long time without working on it. Supper that night was a strange and delicate meal. Maria had made something excellent and gone home to her own family, and the 3 of them sat around the table with the last light fading outside the windows, and Cyrus found himself in the architectural position of a man who is occupying a space he does not quite belong in and cannot gracefully vacate. Ada was to his right, and his father was at the head of the table, and the conversation moved through ordinary topics with a carefulness that suggested everyone at the table was aware they were navigating something that had not yet been named. Elias asked Ada about Ohio. She spoke about it with the balanced honesty of someone who had left a place without regret but without bitterness either. "A farm," she said. Her parents both gone, a brother who had married and whose household had become, with kindness but without cruelty, someone else's house and not hers. She had seen the advertisement and written the first letter on a Tuesday in October sitting at her brother's kitchen table while the wind came in hard off the lake, and she had thought, "There must be more than this for me somewhere." "There is something to be said for the courage of that," Elias said. "Or the foolishness," Ada said, but she said it with a slight smile that took the sting out of it. "Both can look the same from a distance," Cyrus said, and they both looked at him as if they had briefly forgotten he was there, which told him something. That night, lying in the dark again, Cyrus had a direct conversation with himself. The conversation went like this. Ada Wells had come here to marry Cyrus Hale. Cyrus Hale was his father, a good man, a lonely man, a man who had earned his life in his land and had the right to seek companionship in whatever legal and decent way he chose. Whatever Cyrus felt when he sat across a table from Ada Wells, whatever that particular quality of attention was that he could not seem to turn off, it was not relevant. It was not appropriate. It needed to be quiet. He was very firm about this. He did not find it convincing. The next 2 weeks had the quality of something being held in suspension. Ada settled into the Hale ranch with a practical efficiency that was clearly in her nature. She addressed the kitchen garden with genuine enthusiasm, and a pair of leather-work gloves she produced from her trunk, and within a week she had it cleared and turned and replanted in a way that made Maria look at her with the first genuine approval she had shown. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, the feeding times and the water schedules, the names of the horses and the particular temperaments of each. She helped Maria with cooking and with the endless preserving work that kept a household fed through summer, and she proved to have a steady and comfortable way with hard work that earned its own kind of respect. She also had a habit of appearing wherever Cyrus was working. He did not think it was intentional. The ranch was not a large property, and Ada moved through it as though she was systematically learning it, which was a reasonable thing to do when you were considering making a place your home. But it meant that he was frequently aware of her presence, her voice speaking quietly to one of the horses over the corral fence, her figure in the kitchen garden visible from the barn, her sitting on the porch in the evening with a book from the small collection his mother had assembled over years. They talked. They talked the way two people talk when they are living in proximity and share a fundamental intelligence and cannot help it. About the land and the weather and the ranch, about books and about history, about the peculiar character of Arizona territory, and the shapes the light made at different hours of the day. They talked about his mother once, in a conversation that started with the kitchen garden, and moved sideways through something tender that Cyrus had not expected to feel in the middle of a working day. He found himself telling Ada about Margaret Hale in a way he had not told anyone, the specific details, the way she had sung quietly while she worked, the particular color she had planted in the garden's border every spring, the way she had taught Cyrus to read not from a primer but from the natural world, naming things. Ada listened to all of it with the quality of genuine attention, not the polite attending of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but the real kind, the kind that holds what it receives. "She sounds extraordinary," Ada said. "She was," Cyrus said. "She would have liked you." He said it without thinking and regretted it immediately, not because it wasn't true but because of what it meant that he had said it. Ada looked at him with those warm brown eyes, and there was something in her expression that was fragile and honest, and said, without words, that she was aware of exactly what was happening between them and was as uncertain about it as he was. Elias, during these 2 weeks, was kind to Ada in a steady and careful way that Cyrus recognized as his father's genuine effort. He took her riding to show her the boundaries of the property. He asked her opinions about decisions he was considering for the ranch, which was a form of respect that Elias extended to very few people. He was courteous and attentive, and there was no question that he admired her. But Cyrus watched his father and Ada together and saw, with the clarity of a man who was trying very hard not to see it, that what was between them was warm and respectful, and would make a functional marriage by any reasonable standard of the time, and was not the thing that happened when Ada looked up from her book on the porch and found Cyrus watching her from the yard, and neither of them looked away for a beat too long. The situation was resolved, or rather exploded, on a Thursday afternoon in the third week. Cyrus was in the barn doing the kind of work that requires hands but not mind, which meant his mind was free to run in directions he would have preferred it not to, when he heard voices from the direction of the house. Not argument exactly, but elevated, his father's voice and Ada's, both carrying the particular cadence of a conversation that had reached a crux. He went to the barn door. He was not trying to eavesdrop. They were on the front porch and their voices carried on the still afternoon air. He could not have avoided hearing even if he had tried, and he was not trying very hard. "I respect you," Ada was saying, in a voice that was controlled and very clear. "I want to be honest with you because I believe you deserve honesty more than you deserve comfort." "I appreciate that," Elias said, and his voice had the quality of a man who was not surprised by what he was hearing. "I came here with good faith intentions," Ada said. "Everything you wrote in your letters was honest and good, and I do not think I was wrong to come. I think I would make you a capable partner and a good companion, and I think you would make me a secure and respectful home." "All of that is true." A silence. Then Elias, but I do not think I should marry you," Ada said, "and I believe if you look at it clearly you know why." A longer silence. The afternoon wind moved through the yard, turning up the pale dust, disturbing nothing essential. "My son," Elias said at last, "not a question. I am not asking you to be comfortable with it," Ada said. "I am asking you to tell me if I am wrong." Cyrus stood in the barn door and held very still and felt the whole world reorganizing itself around him. After a long moment, Cyrus Hale said, in a voice that was tired and honest and a little sad and ultimately large enough to contain all of those things without bitterness, "You are not wrong." The porch was quiet for a while. Then Elias said, "He hasn't said anything." "He wouldn't," Ada said. "He believes it isn't his place." Another silence. Then, remarkably, his father almost laughed. "He's stubborn that way. Gets it from his mother." "I suspected as much." Cyrus had to sit down on a hay bale because his legs had done something unexpected. He sat there in the barn in the amber smell of hay and leather and horses, and breathed the afternoon air, and thought about a woman on the porch, telling his father the truth that Cyrus had been refusing to tell anyone for 3 weeks. That evening, his father found him at the corral fence, watching the horses move in the last light. Elias stood beside him for a time without speaking, in the manner of men who have learned that some things require settling before they can be discussed. Then he said, "Ada talked to me today." "I heard," Cyrus said. "From the barn, no accusation in it, just fact-finding. I wasn't trying to." "No," Elias leaned on the fence, "I'm not angry." "I know," Cyrus said then. "I should have said something about the stage, about you should have," his father agreed, and the agreement was not angry, but it was honest. "That was a hard spot you put her in, put yourself in, put me in for that matter." "I know," Cyrus said again. Elias was quiet for a long moment. The horses moved through the last light, unhurried. "I'm going to tell you something," Elias said finally. "I placed that advertisement because I was lonely and because I thought it was practical. And when I read Ada's first letter, I thought, this is a fine woman, this is the kind of woman a man would be fortunate to know." He paused. "I was right about that. She is a fine woman, but I was not in love with her when she arrived, and I am not now, and I think—" He stopped again. "I think what I wanted, if I'm honest about it, was the feeling of a house that was alive again the way it was when your mother was in it. That is not a fair thing to want from a stranger." Cyrus said nothing. There was nothing to say to that would not diminish it. "She did not come all this way to be a remedy for loneliness," Elias said. "She came here hoping for something real." "Yes," Cyrus said. His father looked at him sideways. "Do you intend to give it to her?" Cyrus looked at the horses. "I don't know what she wants." "Yes, you do," Elias said. You just don't know if you're allowed to want it too." He pushed off the fence and walked back toward the house, and Cyrus stayed at the corral long after the light was fully gone and the stars were out in their Arizona extravagance overhead. He found Ada sitting on the porch with her book open on her knee, though she was not reading. The lamplight from the window fell across her in a warm, irregular way, and when she heard his footstep on the step she looked up and her expression was completely unguarded in the way faces are when you catch them between the masks they wear. Cyrus sat down on the porch step, not beside her, the step below, so that when he turned he had to look up at her, which felt like the right arrangement. "My father told me you spoke with him today," he said. "Yes," she said. "That took courage." "It was the honest thing," she said simply. He was quiet for a moment. The night sounds of the desert, the crickets, the distant coyote, the movement of air through the creosote filled the space around them. "I owe you an apology," he said. "More than one, probably. I should have told you who I was the moment you stepped off that stage. I should not have let the misunderstanding stand for even an hour. It was not honest, and you deserved honesty from the first minute." She looked at him steadily. "Why didn't you?" The question was fair. It deserved a real answer. Cyrus thought about it honestly, the way he had been trying to avoid thinking about it for 3 weeks. "Because when you stepped down from that stage and looked at this country like you were going to understand it or die trying," he said slowly, I wasn't ready for the conversation to end before it had started." The silence that fell between them was different from all the other silences. It was full rather than empty. Ada Wells looked at him with her warm brown eyes, and something in her expression went soft and real and undefended. "That is a very foolish reason," she said. "I know it," he said. "It is also," she stopped, a small curve of expression, "it is also somewhat understandable." "Is it?" he said. "If you were to ask me what I thought when you took my valise," she said, carefully and deliberately, "I would tell you that I thought, here is a man who is very straightforward and very kind, and he is looking at me as though I am something he was not expecting to find. And I thought that even if everything else about this arrangement is uncertain, that particular expression on that particular face is something I would like to see again." Cyrus was quite still. "And then you told me your name," she continued, "and I understood what I had walked into, and I was," she paused, searching for precision. "I was not angry with you. I was frightened. Because something had already happened in 8 miles of bad road, and I had come here to marry your father, and what I felt on that drive had no place to go." The crickets sang their absolute indifference to human complications. Cyrus stood up from the step and turned to face her properly, and the lamplight moved over his face, and she looked at it the way she looked at the land, like she was memorizing it. "Ada," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and it sat in the air between them like something placed down carefully. "Cyrus," she said. "I do not know what the proper thing to do is," he said honestly. "I know what I feel, and I know it is not a simple situation, and I know that you came a long way and that you are not in a position where you can simply go back, and I would never want anything between us to be about necessity rather than choice." "It is not necessity," she said clearly. "I am capable of finding a situation if this one does not suit. I have skills and I have determination. I am not without options." She held his gaze. "This is a choice." He reached out and took her hand where it rested on the arm of the chair, and she let him, and they stayed like that in the lamplight on the porch of the Hale ranch while the Arizona night spread its impossible stars overhead. After a long moment she said, "What do we do now?" "I think," Cyrus said slowly, "that we do things properly." She raised an eyebrow. "And what does properly look like out here?" "It looks like me asking my father's blessing to court you," he said, "which I will do tomorrow morning. And it looks like courting you, which I am aware sounds somewhat absurd given that you are living in the same house and have already rearranged the kitchen garden, but which I would like to do regardless, properly." Ada Wells looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, with the kind of smile that lives in the corners of the eyes, "That sounds acceptable." He released her hand. They sat for a while longer in companionable quiet, and then she went inside to sleep, and he stayed on the porch and looked at the stars and felt the world arranged into something more honest than it had been an hour before. He spoke to his father the next morning in the yard before breakfast in the direct and honest way that the situation and his conscience required. Elias listened and then said, without ceremony, "I was wondering when you'd manage that." "Is that a yes?" "That's a yes," Elias said. "She's a fine woman, Cyrus. Don't make her wait on the long end of your stubbornness." "I'll do my best." His father looked at him with something that was too complicated to name in a single word, but that contained within it pride and grief and love, and the particular generous sorrow of a man stepping aside for his son. Then he clapped Cyrus once on the shoulder and went in to breakfast. What followed was a courtship of genuine and charming awkwardness, conducted in the practical circumstances of a working ranch, and therefore lacking the fine drawing rooms and evening promenades that the novels Ada occasionally read described. They had instead the long rides in the late afternoon when the heat had broken, and the desert took on its evening gold, during which they talked with the freedom of people who had already dispensed with preliminary courtesies and could simply be honest with each other. They had the shared suppers at the table where Elias was present and perfectly civil, and occasionally managed a dry observation that made both of them laugh. They had the kitchen garden, which became a kind of project they worked on together, Ada directing and Cyrus following directions with more willingness than he usually showed, and Maria watching from the kitchen door with an expression that had by now resolved entirely into approval. Cyrus learned, during these weeks, the specific substance of Ada Wells. He learned that she had educated herself thoroughly despite having had only the education a rural Ohio farming community provided, by the simple mechanism of reading everything she could find. He learned that she had strong opinions about fairness and expressed them clearly and without apology, but also without cruelty. He learned that she was braver than she looked, which was already fairly brave, and that her composure was not coldness but its opposite, a quality of deep feeling held in careful check by a disciplined mind. He learned that she was funny in a dry and particular way that you could miss if you weren't paying attention, and that she paid attention to everything. She learned things about him, too. She learned the shape of his days and the quality of his silences, of which there were several varieties: the comfortable silence of a man at peace with his work, the troubled silence of a man wrestling with something he hadn't yet resolved, and the third silence, the one that was particular to when he was near her, which was not uncomfortable but was very aware. She learned that he was the kind of man who did things rather than said them, and that if you watched what he did the language was rich and specific. She noticed that he had quietly had the buckboard cushion replaced with a padded version without mentioning it, and that he had moved a chair to the porch where the morning light was best because she liked to read there, and that he told her the truth even when it was uncomfortable, and she valued that more than almost anything. A month after her arrival, he kissed her. It happened on a Sunday, which was the day Redemption Springs had church, and they had ridden in together on the buckboard with the padded cushion, and the Reverend Moss had delivered a sermon about the nature of unexpected gifts, which Cyrus had been unable to listen to without a particular quality of irony. On the drive back, with the afternoon sun laying long shadows across the desert and the air smelling of sage and warm earth, Ada had said something about the sermon that made him laugh genuinely, the full kind of laugh that a person doesn't arrange but simply produces, and he had turned to look at her with the laugh still in his face, and she was looking back at him with an expression that was open and warm and entirely certain, and he pulled the buckboard to a stop in the middle of the road and kissed her. She kissed him back immediately and completely, without any pretense of reluctance, which was exactly characteristic of her. When they pulled apart, she looked at him with those October eyes and said, "It took you long enough." "I was being proper," he said. "You were being absurd," she said, and she was laughing when she said it. He took her hand and they drove the rest of the way home in the warm afternoon, and when they came into the yard, his father was sitting on the porch and looked at the two of them on the buckboard and said, to no one in particular, Finally, 3 weeks after the Sunday kiss, on a warm October evening, with the mountains going purple at the edges of the sky, Cyrus Hale asked Ada Wells to marry him. He did it on the porch, which had become their place in the way that particular places become particular to particular people, with the lamplight falling warm and the stars beginning to arrive above the desert. He did not have a ring. He told her that honestly, that he intended to have one made in Redemption Springs by the jeweler who worked out of the back of the general store, who was capable of fine work if given the time, and that he would have it for her within the week, but that he could not wait for the ring to ask the question because the question was its own thing, and the ring was its own thing, and he did not want them to be confused. Ada Wells listened to all of this with her hands folded and her expression very still, and then said, "Yes, just that, yes," in the voice of a woman who had thought about it very carefully and was entirely certain. Cyrus had the ring made, a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone set into it because turquoise was the color of the Arizona sky, and he wanted her to carry the sky on her hand. He gave it to her on a Tuesday morning over coffee at the kitchen table, and she looked at it for a long time, and then looked at him with an expression that he would carry in his memory for the rest of his life. "It is exactly right," she said. They were married on a Saturday in November, in Redemption Springs, by Reverend Moss in the shared church, which that particular weekend belonged to the Methodists, but which the Baptists and the Presbyterians had both agreed to attend anyway, because the whole town had a feeling about this occasion that went past denominational boundaries. Maria Quintero sat in the front row in her good dress with a satisfaction, so complete it was almost visible as a separate object. Cyrus Hale stood beside his son as witness, and he stood with the dignity of a man who had come to understand that some things are not losses, but simply different kinds of gifts. Ada wore her blue dress, the one she had worn on the stage, which she had pressed and mended, and which was her best, and also now, by association, something more, and she walked down the aisle of the shared church under the eyes of the people of Redemption Springs with her head up and her eyes on Cyrus's face, and the turquoise ring already on her hand. Cyrus stood at the front of the church and watched her come toward him and thought, with a clarity that cut through every complication and every misstep and every moment of confusion that had preceded this one, that he had been waiting his whole life for a woman to walk toward him exactly like this, as if she knew where she was going and had no doubt at all about it. Reverend Moss performed the service with genuine feeling and an admirable economy of words, and when Cyrus said, "I do," the church was so quiet you could hear the Arizona wind against the windows, and when Ada said it in her clear, certain voice, there was an audible collective exhale from the assembled people of Redemption Springs, as though the whole town had been holding its breath. The celebration afterward was held in the open space beside the general store, which had been strung with lanterns for the occasion, and the entirety of Redemption Springs appeared to attend, including people Cyrus was not entirely certain he had met before. Someone had produced a fiddle, and someone else had produced a second fiddle, and a third person had contributed a guitar, and there was dancing of the entirely unrehearsed and enthusiastically sincere variety that small Western towns produced on occasions of celebration. Ada danced with her husband in the lantern light on the Arizona dust, and the fiddles played something sweet and fast, and she was laughing that unguarded full laugh that she had produced exactly once on the drive from the stage, and which he had been cataloging ever since. And Cyrus held her hand in her waist and thought, "I did not correct the confusion when she stepped off that stage, and I will be grateful for my own failure of honesty until the day I die." Elias danced with Maria Quintero, which surprised everyone, including apparently both of them, and Maria laughed in a way that was considerably younger than 60, and Elias looked pleased in a way that had nothing complicated in it, which was its own kind of good thing. They went home to the ranch in the late evening under the full extravagance of the Arizona stars, and the house that had been his father's and his mother's, and then just his father's, and then confusingly everyone's was now, straightforwardly, theirs. Ada stood in the doorway of the room that had been the guest room, the good room with the east-facing window and the morning light, and looked at Cyrus standing in the hall and said, "I believe this room could use a new rug." He laughed. He laughed the whole way down the hall. Their first winter at the ranch was the kind of winter that reveals whether a partnership is made of good material, because a working ranch in winter is demanding and unglamorous, and requires consistent effort in conditions that discourage consistent effort. Ada proved herself comprehensively. She rose before light without complaint. She learned to manage the practical necessities of the household in the particular way of ranch life, and she expanded her territory steadily. The kitchen garden in winter was reduced but not abandoned. She planted cold-hardy things and planned ahead for spring, and she approached the household accounts with a methodical precision that revealed a financial mind considerably sharper than Elia's had realized, and considerably sharper, Cyrus admitted, than his own. She also found her way to the town more deliberately as winter settled in, which was how she met Eleanor Marsh, who ran the schoolhouse on the edge of Redemption Springs, and who was the kind of woman who recognized another capable woman on sight. Eleanor was 35 and had come west from Virginia 8 years prior for her own complicated reasons, and had never gone back, and she and Ada established a friendship with the efficiency of two people who recognize in each other a similar quality of mind. Eleanor had a small library she had assembled over 8 years, and Ada borrowed from it freely and returned the books with notes tucked into the pages, and Eleanor wrote back in the margins, and this correspondence in borrowed books delighted them both. Through Eleanor, Ada also came to understand more fully the particular situation of the territory she had come to inhabit. Redemption Springs in 1884 sat in a complicated landscape. The Apache conflicts that had marked the preceding years had left their marks on the region and on the people in it, and the injustices of that history were visible in the land, and in the faces of those who had been displaced from it. Ada was not a woman who could witness injustice without acknowledging it, and she sat with Eleanor over many winter evenings talking about the shape of the territory and its past and the obligations that came with living in a place where so much had been taken from so many. "What do we do with that knowledge?" she asked Eleanor once. "We hold it," Eleanor said, "and we act on it where we can. We do not pretend it didn't happen, and we do not let others pretend it in our hearing." Ada held that. She brought it home and turned it over in her thinking the way she turned the soil in her garden, and she talked to Cyrus about it with a directness that she would extend to everything she cared about, and he listened, and they thought about it together, and they were both the better for thinking rather than looking away. Winter gave way to the particular Arizona spring, which was not the soft green affair of Ohio Springs, but was its own fierce and brief beauty, wildflowers across the desert floor in quantities that seemed impossible from the dry landscape that had produced them, and the air sharp and sweet before the heat came back, and the whole world smelling of sage and possibility. It was in that spring that Ada told Cyrus she was going to have a child. She told him on a morning in April, at the kitchen table with the coffee between them, with the same direct and considered quality she brought to every important thing. She watched his face as she said it, and saw the expression move through him in layers, the first layer quick and electric and barely containable, the second layer softer and slower, something that looked like a man understanding something about the shape of his own life that he had not fully understood before. He got up from his chair and came around the table and took her face in both his hands and looked at her for a long moment and then said, very quietly, "Ada," just her name, nothing else, but she understood everything in it. He sat back down beside her rather than across from her, and she leaned against his shoulder, and they sat in the spring morning with the coffee going cold between them and the sun coming in through the east window and everything ahead of them. Elia's, when told, went outside and stood in the yard for a long time with his face toward the mountains and his hands in his pockets, and when he came back his eyes were somewhat brighter than usual, and he said, with an attempt at casualness that did not quite succeed, "Well, well then." Maria, when told, took Ada's hands and said several things in a rapid blend of English and Spanish that did not require translation, because the substance of them was perfectly clear. Elinor, when told via a letter delivered to the schoolhouse, wrote back in the margins of a borrowed book, "I am so very pleased. He is a good man, and you are precisely the best thing that ever happened to him." The summer that year was hot as summers in Arizona always are, which is to say comprehensively and with full commitment, and Ada managed it with the same competent stubbornness she brought to everything else, though she did accept, with rather more grace than Cyrus expected, his persistent campaign to ensure she did not overwork herself. He worried in the particular constant low-level way of a man who is deeply in love and therefore deeply aware of everything that could go wrong, and Ada found this simultaneously touching and mildly exasperating, and told him both things directly, which was her way. "I am not fragile," she said one afternoon in July when he had appeared at the kitchen garden for the third time in an hour. "I am increasing, which is a different matter entirely." "I know that," Cyrus said. "Then go do the fence work you were supposed to be doing. The fence can wait, Cyrus. The south section of fence has been waiting since March. Another hour won't hurt it." She pointed at him with the gardening trowel. He went back to the fence, not without looking over his shoulder 3 times. Their son was born in November, on a cold, clear night with the stars out in full display above the Arizona desert, delivered by the capable hands of Dr. Emmett Trask, who had been practicing medicine in Redemption Springs since before the war, and who handled the business with the efficiency of long practice. Elias sat in the front room and was not capable of sitting still for more than 4 minutes at a stretch. Maria was in the kitchen making coffee that no one drank. Cyrus was where he was supposed to be and where he intended to remain. The baby arrived at 2:30 in the morning, and the sound he made filling up his lungs for the first time was the most extraordinary thing Cyrus had ever heard. He looked at this small new person, red-faced and already emphatic about the situation, and then he looked at Ada, who was exhausted and radiant in the particular way of women who have done something enormous and know it, and he could not say anything for a considerable moment. "He's beautiful," he managed at last, in a voice that did not sound entirely like his usual voice. "He is very loud," Ada said, with great tenderness. "He gets that from your side," Cyrus said, and Ada laughed even though she was exhausted. They named him James Elias Hale, the James for Ada's father, who had been a quiet farmer in Ohio and had loved his daughter fiercely, and the Elias for his grandfather, who was currently in the front room having the most emotional time he had experienced since his wife died, and who came in when permitted with his hat in his hands, and stood at the foot of the bed looking at this new smallest person with an expression that had no words in any language adequate to it. "James," Elias said, testing the name. "James Elias," Ada said from the bed, "if that's acceptable to you." Elias Hale, who had not cried at his wife's funeral because there had been too much to do and not enough time, and the grief had gone somewhere internal where it had stayed, had tears running freely down his weathered face. He did not seem to notice. "That is more than acceptable," he said. James Elias Hale was, from his first morning, an opinionated and energetic presence whose views on the schedule of his own needs were extremely clear and vigorously expressed. He grew through that winter and into the spring in the way babies do when they are well loved and well fed, which is to say visibly, and with a kind of determination that seemed personal. By spring he was sitting up and examining his world with large dark eyes that had resolved into something very like his mother's, and Cyrus would come in from the morning work and find Ada sitting in the chair by the east window with James in her lap, and the morning light on them both, and he would stop in the doorway for a moment every single time, because the image never stopped being remarkable. "You are standing in the doorway again," Ada would say. without looking up. "I'm assessing the structural integrity of the doorframe," Cyrus would say. "You are being sentimental. I categorically deny that." James, who had no opinion on the question of sentiment, would look at his father with the focused intensity of a person for whom everything is still new and surprising, and Cyrus would cross the room and sit beside them both, and the morning would proceed. As James grew into toddlerhood and then early childhood, the Hale Ranch took on the particular quality of a place where life is genuinely being lived. Ada expanded the kitchen garden over 2 more seasons, until it was producing enough that she had surplus to trade at the general store, and to put up in quantities that kept the household fed through winter with room to spare. She established, through her friendship with Alina and through her own considerable directness, a small lending library at the church, the shared church, which all 3 congregations agreed was appropriate common ground for such a project. And she was the kind of woman who made things happen not by demanding them, but by simply beginning them and letting others see what was being built and choose to participate. Cyrus watched all of this with the steady and comprehensive admiration of a man who had been surprised by love and had decided to pay attention to it consistently. He worked the ranch hard and well, building the herd steadily in the years that followed their marriage, and he had a good head for what the land would and wouldn't support, and he made the right decisions more often than not. He and his father worked together with an ease that had not always characterized their relationship. Elias was a man with strong opinions about the correct way to do things, and Cyrus was a man who had his own opinions, and the negotiation of those had been the recurring domestic weather of Cyrus's growing years. But something in the intervening years had shifted it, and they worked now as partners in the genuine sense, 2 men with different qualities bringing them to bear on a shared enterprise. Elias had also, in the 2 years following the wedding, developed a quiet and growing friendship with Maria Quintero that had begun with that single surprise dance at the wedding, and had proceeded in the careful manner appropriate to 2 people of mature years, who were not certain. They had the right to want something, but who wanted it regardless. Maria's husband had been dead for 11 years. Elias' wife had been dead for 4. They approached each other with the particular caution of people who have already loved once and know the weight of it, and the thing between them grew slowly and with great care, and was, by the time Ada noticed it clearly and said something direct to Cyrus about it, something substantial. "Your father and Maria," Ada said one evening. "I know," Cyrus said. "He should say something. He knows that. When will he say something?" "When he's ready," Cyrus said. "He takes his time." "He has been taking his time for 2 years. He's a deliberate man." Ada gave him a look. "He is a stubborn man," she said. "I wonder where you get it from." Cyrus had no response to that. Elias did say something, as it turned out, the following spring. He said it to Maria in the kitchen garden, which had become the site of more significant conversations on the Hale Ranch than any garden had a right to expect. And whatever he said, and whatever she answered, they came in to supper that evening looking like 2 people who had put something down that they had been carrying for a long time. They were married that summer in a ceremony that was smaller and quieter than Cyrus and Ada's, but no less real, with James Hale, aged 2.5, present in his best clothes and maintaining a remarkable dignity for approximately the first 10 minutes before he became comprehensively distracted by a dog that had wandered in from the street. The family that had been assembled from such peculiar and complicated beginnings was, by the autumn of 1887, a real one. Elias and Maria settled into a domestic ease that was clearly a specific and mutual happiness. The ranch house held more people and more noise and more life than it had in the difficult, quiet years after Margaret Hale's death, and Elias moved through his days with a solidity that his son watched with private gratitude. Ada, in the fall of that year, told Cyrus she was expecting their 2nd child. He handled this announcement with considerably more composure than the first, meaning he only sat very still for about 30 seconds before he started being impossible to contain. Ada watched him with the expression she wore when he was being obvious, and told him, with the precision of a woman who has made a study of another person, that he was handling the news very well. "I am a picture of calm," Cyrus said. "You have knocked over your coffee. I have done that on purpose to test the structural integrity of the floor. You," Ada said, "are the most transparent man I have ever met." "You love it," he said. She looked at him with her warm brown eyes, and the October quality of them was unchanged from the first morning she had sat across his kitchen table, and everything she felt was in them without any guard at all, because she had stopped guarding it against him some time ago and did not miss the effort. "Yes," she said simply, "I do." The second child arrived in the early spring, with the wildflowers already beginning to come in across the desert floor. And she was a girl, which James received with the solemn and uncertain gravity of a 3-year-old trying to determine what exactly this meant for his existing arrangements. Her name was Margaret Ada Hale, the Margaret for Cyrus's mother, whose kitchen garden was now famous in the territory for what Ada had made of it, and the Ada, which Cyrus had put in without asking, and which Ada had said nothing about for a moment, and then said quietly, that it was too much and meant everything and was exactly right. Margaret was, from the beginning, nothing like her brother. James had been emphatic and energetic. Margaret was watchful. She looked at the world around her with a focus that reminded Ada powerfully of her own nature, and Cyrus said once, looking at his infant daughter examining her own hand with academic intensity, that Margaret was going to know everything about everything by the time she was 5, and Ada said that she planned to make sure of it. Alina Marsh continued to be Ada's closest friend through all these years, and the lending library that Ada had started grew past anyone's expectation, which is the way things grow when they're genuinely needed. Alina also, somewhere in the course of these years, came to know a man named Howard Briggs who ran a small horse breeding operation 30 miles north of Redemption Springs, and who had been introduced to Alina by Cyrus in the casual way that men introduce people when they believe two people might suit without ever saying so directly. Ada, who noticed everything, noticed this and said to Cyrus, "Did you arrange that?" "I introduced them at the supply day," Cyrus said. "What people do after that is their own business." "You arranged it," Ada said. Cyrus drank his coffee. Howard and Alina were married the following year, which added another friendship to the constellation of the Hale Ranch's connection to the territory around it, and which expanded the world for all of them in small, incremental ways that accumulate into something meaningful over time. James Hale, growing up through these years, had his father's stubborn streak and his mother's analytical precision, and his grandfather Elia's physical confidence, and was the kind of child who tested the limits of everything because testing limits was how he understood what was true. Ada managed this with a patience that was not permissiveness. She was clear with him and direct, and she held her standards, but she also made it clear that her standards came from love of him and not from the convenience of his compliance, and the distinction mattered. Cyrus watched his son grow and recognized himself in the boy and recognized Ada and recognized, in the way the boy moved through the world, the particular quality of a child who has been genuinely loved. Margaret, 2 years behind her brother, was quieter and sharper, and had opinions expressed with precision, and a complete absence of self-consciousness that occasionally made adults look at each other over her head with expressions of mild astonishment. At 4 years old, she told old Pete Dawson at the general store with great seriousness that his organization system for the dry goods was inefficient and she had a suggestion, and Pete had been so astonished that he listened to her and then implemented the suggestion, and the store ran better for it. "She gets it from you," Cyrus told Ada. "She gets it from both of us," Ada said. "We are both unreasonable in our opinions." "I am perfectly reasonable. You told the fence post last Tuesday that it was being difficult." "The fence post was being difficult," Ada laughed, Margaret looked between her parents with the expression of a person cataloging information for future use. In the late spring of 1890, on a morning that was already warm with the particular promise of a hot summer, Ada and Cyrus rode out to the eastern boundary of the property on the horses that they kept for pleasure riding rather than work. Ada's mare, Clover, a compact gray that had been a gift from Elia's on their 3rd anniversary, and Cyrus's big bay buck, who had been his horse for 12 years, and whose opinions about the correct pace of a morning ride were strong and consistently expressed. They rode to the ridge that looked out over the desert floor, where on clear mornings you could see 60 miles in every direction, and the world looked like something that had been arranged by someone with large ambitions and access to good materials. They stopped at the top of the ridge and sat their horses in the morning air and looked out at the country together. And it was as beautiful as it had ever been, the desert in its late spring complexity before the heat stripped it back, the wildflowers still holding here and there in the sheltered spots, the distant mountains in their permanent purple, the sky the particular Arizona blue that never looked the same twice. "I used to think," Ada said after a long, comfortable silence, "that I knew what I was coming to when I boarded that stage in Ohio." "What did you think you were coming to?" Cyrus asked. She considered it honestly the way she considered everything. "Security," she said, "practical partnership, a place of my own. Those were the things I had been without, and those were the things I had thought to find." She paused. "I did not expect this. The view." "You," she said, with a simplicity that was its own kind of largeness. He reached across the gap between their horses and took her hand, and she gave it, and they sat together on the ridge in the Arizona morning with their hands linked and 60 miles of desert before them and the ranch behind them and James and Margaret under Maria's excellent supervision, and the whole completed present tense of their lives. "I made a mistake when I met you," Cyrus said. "A deliberate one. I told myself it wasn't a lie." "It wasn't the finest start," Ada agreed. "It gave us 8 miles, he said. She looked at him. "It gave us everything," she said. They rode back down from the ridge in the warming morning, with the horses easy and the desert settling into its daytime self around them. And the Hale ranch came into view across the flat, and Cyrus could see James in the yard already up to something with a stick and a bucket, and the kitchen garden standing in its ordered rows, and the smoke from the chimney, and the east window catching the light, and everything he had wanted without knowing how to want it present and accounted for. He was a man who had spent his life on this land, and knew it the way you know the face of a person you love, every feature particular and unrepeatable. And he had come to know, with the same completeness and the same gratitude, the face and the mind, and the specific irreplaceable quality of the woman riding beside him, who had stepped off a stage in the red dust of the Arizona afternoon to marry someone else, and had instead become the whole of what his life was made of. That evening Cyrus sat on the porch in the last light, the same porch where he had taken Ada's hand for the first time, where she had told him yes, where they had sat through dozens of evenings watching the stars come up over the desert. The house behind him was full of sound, James's voice explaining something with great authority, Margaret's measured responses, Ada's voice above them both, the sound of Maria and Elia's uncomfortable old married conversation from the other end of the house. The fiddle someone 3 properties over played in the evenings was just barely audible on the air. Ada came out and sat beside him close, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into his side with the ease of long practice, and they watched the evening do what Arizona evenings do, which is to put on a performance of color that requires no audience but rewards anyone present. "James told Margaret today that she was doing it wrong," Ada said. "What was she doing wrong? Breathing, I believe. He'll grow out of it. He'll grow into it," Ada said. "He'll be just like you, entirely certain about everything. That's not," he stopped. "That might be accurate." She laughed quietly, and he felt it through his side where she leaned against him, and he held her a little closer, and the evening went on doing its extraordinary work above them. James Elias Hale, rancher's son, would grow to be 13 that November, and by that age he already moved through the ranch with the comfortable authority of a boy who had been learning it his whole life, who knew the animals by name and by temperament, who could read the sky for weather and the land for water, who had his mother's mind and his father's hands, and who was going to be, everyone who knew him agreed, something real. Margaret Ada Hale, at 11, was already reading her way through every book the lending library held and had recently informed her mother with complete seriousness that she intended to be a teacher, possibly also a writer, and additionally a person who fixed things, because fixing things was satisfying and the world contained many things that needed fixing. Ada had said she thought all three were achievable. Cyrus had said he thought the ranch needed a new corral and wondered if Margaret might want to start with that. And Margaret had looked at him with the look of a person determining whether they are being humored, decided she was, and gone back to her book. Elias at 68 was slowing in the way strong men slow, stubbornly and gradually, and without much acknowledgement of the fact. He still went out every morning and still had opinions about the correct way to manage every aspect of the operation, but he now primarily expressed those opinions verbally rather than physically, and the understanding was that Cyrus ran the ranch and Elias advised, and this arrangement suited both of them. Maria managed him with the serenity of a woman who had raised 5 children and was not remotely intimidated by a large, stubborn man with strong opinions, and they were happy together in a way that was solid and warm and without drama, which was exactly the right kind of happy for 2 people of their years. The ranch continued to grow. Cyrus made decisions about the herd and the land that proved sound over time, and by 1892, the Hale operation was one of the more established in the territory, and there were people who came to ask Cyrus's advice about the land and the animals, and he gave it without ceremony in the direct way of a man who does not confuse expertise with importance. Ada's kitchen garden had by now expanded into a proper kitchen orchard on the south side of the house, and the apple and apricot trees she had planted in the early years were productive and permanent and smelled, in their season, extraordinary. The lending library had grown to the point where Eleanor Briggs had suggested to the town council that Redemption Springs ought to have a proper building for it, and the town council, who were generally conservative about expenditure, had looked at the actual number of people who used the thing and agreed with a quickness that surprised everyone, including Eleanor. Ada served on the committee that established the new library building, and on the day it opened she stood at the door of the small adobe structure with its bookshelves and its reading table and its good east-facing windows, and she felt something that was specifically about what a place could become when people decided to make something real in it. In the evening of the library's opening day, she told Cyrus about the feeling, sitting on their porch in the old way, watching the stars. "I did not know what I was building when I started it," she said. "I just knew that a place without books felt like a house without windows." "You say that like it's a small thing," Cyrus said. "It is a small thing," she said. "It's just also not." He considered this. "Like coming in from the stage in a cloud of red dust to marry the wrong man," he said. She looked at him with those eyes. "You were never the wrong man," she said. "You were always the right one. I just didn't know which name to attach to you yet." He kissed her in the way of a man who has kissed the same woman for 8 years and has not run out of reasons to. The stars went on overhead in their reliable profusion. Somewhere inside the house, a small voice announced something emphatic, and another small voice responded with authority. In the yard, the horses moved quietly in the corral. The kitchen garden gave off its night smell of turned earth and green growing things. The mountains stood at the edges of the world in their permanent watch. Cyrus Hale put his arm around his wife on the porch of the house his father had built and thought, as he did when he allowed himself to think it without irony, about a stagecoach coming in 2 hours late through a cloud of red dust, and a woman stepping down into the Arizona afternoon with a valise in one hand and a world of uncertainty ahead of her, and a man who had been sent to collect someone else's future and had instead found his own. He had not corrected the confusion. She had not corrected it either. And in the long accounting of things, he thought, there were mistakes that were not entirely mistakes, and confusions that led somewhere truer than clarity might have. And a woman who had come across half a continent to marry a man she had never met and had instead found, through 8 miles of bad road and a shared kitchen table, and a single unguarded laugh at a story about 3 denominations and 1 church, the thing she had actually been looking for. The night settled over the Hale Ranch in the way Arizona nights settle, completely, fully, without reservation, giving the stars everything. James was asleep. Margaret was almost certainly still reading by whatever light she had managed to secure. Elias and Maria were content in their end of the house. The animals were quiet. The land was still. Ada leaned her head against Cyrus's shoulder in the way she always did, exactly perfectly, and he held her as he always did, and the porch held them, and the house held the porch, and the land held the house, and everything was present and accounted for and entirely closed. Like a good story whose last page you hold a moment before you close the cover because you are not quite ready to have it finished, even though everything has been resolved and everyone has found their right place, and the ending is exactly what it should be. Outside, the desert breathed. Inside, someone laughed. The stars continued their ancient and indifferent burning. Cyrus pressed his lips to the top of Ada's dark hair and said nothing, because there was nothing more to say, and she understood him perfectly.